All right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here on a Monday morning, bright and early. We really appreciate you. Just want to welcome you to the first workshop of Workshop Week for the Recovery Task Force. My name is John Romine. I'm part of the team here at Collaboratory, and we're hoping that we can get to some really rich conversation this morning to start to frame some of the more detailed initiatives that will be in the recovery and resilience plan that I'll touch on in a minute. But before we get too far in, I do want to go over a couple sort of housekeeping items. For those of you that are either at the branch table or at the front table, the panel table, you have microphones in front of you. When you speak, please push the button. The light will turn from red to green. That is so folks that are watching live can hear you. Some of the microphones we had a little technology issue this morning. Some of the microphones will sound back through the room, but some of them won't, but they will be heard on Zoom or on YouTube where it's streaming live. This is a public meeting. So at the end, we will have public comment. This is about a 90-minute meeting. And so we have about only 15 minutes held for public comment after the bulk of the meeting's over, the workshop's over. And then we have our next workshop starts at 11 o'clock. So today is all about critical infrastructure, and we're starting with natural resources, which is a super important priority for our community. So with that, I'm going to, we'll do some quick introductions of the panelists. So we'll start at that end. Roland, if you don't mind starting, introduce yourself, your organization, and then we'll work our way this way.
Good morning. I'm Roland Ottolini with Lee County Division of Natural Resources. I'm currently as the director.
Good morning, Maya Robert, City of Cape Coral, Public Works. I'm the Environmental Resource Manager.
Good morning. I'm James Evans. I'm the CEO of the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation.
Morning, Jeff Carney. I'm with the University of Florida. I'm the director of the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience.
Good morning, Nicole Idavia, Director of Research and Restoration for the Coastal and Heartland National Estuary Partnership.
Mike Sprayberry. I'm the Senior Advisor for Haggerty Consulting.
Good morning, I'm Tessa Lesage. I work here at Collaboratory, and I'm happy to be here to help support the facilitation this morning.
Great, thank you. And then we have a whole slew of our support team here from Haggerty and Collaboratory. I actually didn't say Collaboratory, that's impressive. So, you know, as we go through this and beyond, if you have any questions, please ask. And I do want to say we do have branch members from multiple branches here today, so appreciate you all being here to participate in the conversation. So real quick high level overview of what the Recovery Task Force is. So after the Hurricane Ian, the Board of County Commissioners approved, based on the FEMA disaster recovery framework, a recovery task force that's made up of the elected bodies of within the Lee County geography. So you can see, and it's here's the list of those individuals that represent those municipalities and districts. And then Commissioner Kevin Ruane is the chair of the Recovery Task Force and voted by the Board of County Commissioners. There are 8 branches. So you have planning and capacity, economic recovery, education, workforce, health and social services, infrastructure, housing, natural resources, and cultural resources. And all of these work together to make up, based on the FEMA framework, plus a little tweaks that we made for our community for the work of the Recovery Task Force. We're on a really aggressive timeline. So this may be why it felt like the time frame to get folks to participate was super urgent. We're driving towards December 5th. That is when the Board of County Commissioners will vote on the Recovery and Resilience Plan for Lee County. So we are in the second stage of developing that plan. So we've been collecting information. We did robust community engagement. and really starting to prioritize what is important for us to be a more resilient Lee County. So we are now in that development of the plan phase, and we will be really iterating on priorities and initiatives that will make up the plan over the next couple of months. So this is a little look at our community engagement. So we had 15 in-person town halls, and several were both in English and Spanish. We had 2 virtual town halls, one in English, one in Spanish. 37 mentions in media articles about those town halls, more than 1,000 participants. And then what's still available and still online is the survey for people to share what their priorities are. And we're almost to 5,000 survey responses so far. And then on March 30th, we had a community-wide, a region-wide event. Actually, it was called On the Table, where folks participated around the community to understand what their priorities are for their communities. And so we had about a little over 1,000 folks submitted a survey for that as well. So today's work, this week I said is workshop week. Every month we have what's branch week. And so that's where all 8 branches, they meet and they're really narrowing in on what their priorities are, what those initiatives will be for the resilience plan. And so now we're into this, like, how do we develop those initiatives? And so many of you are the subject matter experts that the branches recommended to be, to learn more from, to understand how should we prioritize certain areas of the plan. Each branch is responsible for developing initiatives for their section of the plan. And ultimately, many of them overlap and are interconnected. So that's why infrastructure includes natural resources as well. And so there's 4 days of workshops this week, today, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. The themes are there on the right. So Wednesday is supporting business and workforce. Thursday is community resilience, and Friday is all. Now we're recording. Can you click the got it, please? Thank you. Oh. And so, and then Friday is all about housing. And so that is really looking at the 3 sort of buckets that make up housing on Friday. So branch members can attend any workshop. That's why we have a mix of branch members here, from critical infrastructure to natural resources and others, as can the public. So these are all publicly noticed meetings. So we have 3 workshops today on critical infrastructure. We have 4 workshops on Wednesday around workforce and supporting businesses, 4 workshops on Thursday about community resilience, and 3 workshops on Friday about housing. And so they're all 90 minutes to 2 hours, depending on the topic. So this is number 1. So we'd love your feedback, love a little patience as we try to figure out how to make this work, both in person and streaming live and recording for the public. So anybody that can't make a workshop can attend or can watch it back online. So this one is about protecting, restoring, and enhancing natural resources to support health and resilience. And so one of the things that we're going to really start to dive into is, what does that look like as we start to build out the initiatives for the plan. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Tessa, and she's going to facilitate the conversation around so what we're trying to achieve and the questions that we're sort of going to ask of the subject matter experts. And then there will be a section for branch members to ask questions as well. One note, the power infrastructure branch or workshop has been moved, I believe, to June 21st, the afternoon of June 21st. It was rescheduled because one of the most critical players could not participate this afternoon. And so that one will be a standalone workshop on June 21st in the afternoon, and it will be held here as well. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Tessa.
Thank you. Do I need the slides? Yep. Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. How are you? It's Monday. Is everybody caffeinated and ready to go? Awesome. All right. Well, let's get going because we don't have forever. And I definitely know we need to hear a lot from this amazing panel, because natural resources is such a huge and important part of our economy and of our resilience here in Southwest Florida. So the first question I wanted to ask, and we can get started. We can start with you, Roland, down at the end there. How do we need to rethink the relationship between natural resources and resilience?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of rethinking. I think it's doing more that what we do know about our natural resources. Lee County is dependent, water management is very heavily dependent on natural resources. We depend on natural resources for our flood protection, water quality, and water supplies. Basically, we may have a canal network as such, but everything leads to either natural creeks, wetlands, sloughs. Floodplains are very important. Natural floodplains and our natural creeks are very important. So wetlands are very important for polishing water quality. And also there are certain areas in the DRGR that are also very important for groundwater recharge. So it's not a matter of doing something different. It's a matter of incorporating those ideas. And when we look at the landscape out there, so it's important is really basically keeping space and interconnectivity with our water systems. If you look at an aerial right now, you can see all the older development. It looks like a patchwork. It's a mosaic of piecemeal cookie cutter projects that were basically, historically, you just build a berm around your property and you build your stormwater system internally, and then you discharge to the nearest ditch nearby. As we've moved into master planning with watersheds, we've looked at those interconnections with water systems and making sure that when new development comes in or opportunities for redevelopment, that we provide that interconnectivity.
Okay, that's really helpful. It's a great sort of overview. So this idea of interconnected water systems helps us manage water as a county, as opposed to just thinking individually, piece by piece, development by development. And there are opportunities both with new development and with redevelopment to rethink how we do that. So from the city of Cape Coral's perspective, what would you like to add? It's okay.
I think when it comes to critical infrastructure, I believe we should, rather than sometimes think of natural resources as an afterthought or permitting requirements, we should really start incorporating this as a forefront of any type of action that we have, keeping in mind that natural resources is really the driving force of our local economy. I agree with what Roland have said. We do have a patchwork of different type of natural resources. Cape Coral is very, unique with all the canals we have. I think that we have to also keep in mind that as we look into the future and resiliency, we have to keep in mind that natural resources also drive the health of our community. We've talked about, mental health. So when we think about rebuilding and having low-income housing and projects of that nature, we need to think about incorporating natural resources into those actions. If we look into critical infrastructure, whether it's transportation, large utilities infrastructure, we have to incorporate that. So beyond what Roland has said, which is a network of interconnectivity for water management, I would like to see interconnectivity of natural resources within large infrastructure project, whether it's transportation, housing, or bridges and things like that, because that's what's going to make our community stronger and resilient. I have more things to say, but I'm going to pass on.
Okay. All right. So we'll remember you have more things to say. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So a couple of things. Most people are actually on Zoom since, this is like the last week of school and people are getting ready to go on vacation and everything else. So don't forget to make sure you if you bend the mic down towards your mouth and then talk into the mic so that we're sure that everyone on Zoom and the recording can hear us, that would be fantastic. All right, James, what do you want to add to this discussion about the relationship between natural resources and resilience?
So first off, I agree with everything that Roland and Maya said. And preservation of our natural resources is really the best way to make Lee County more resilient. And so when you look at how communities like Sanibel, who have a strong track record of preservation of their lands, and you compare it to other areas that were impacted that have a lot of infrastructure, it's a pretty stark difference between those areas. And we know that the natural resources are critical to our tourism-based economy here in Lee County. You know, we generate over $3 billion here annually. And a lot of that's due to our beaches, our water quality, fishing, and other reasons that people come from all over the world to come to Lee County. And I think it's also important that we don't lose sight of that, because if we're using this process or any other process to justify the need for density increases or developed area in those most sensitive areas, I think we're going in the wrong direction. And we need to make sure that we're preserving those most vulnerable resources first, our coastal wetlands, our mangrove forests, those things that are the first line of defense for this storm and future storms. We need to make sure that we're preserving those for the future. And so I think when we look at places like the DRGR, or we're looking at the coastal barrier islands, those are areas where we should be looking to keep growth at a minimum, not looking for ways to increase density in developed areas. So I think that's going to be critical as we look forward, looking at preservation as a tool for making our community more resilient.
Okay. So Jeff, no pressure, but I'm going to ask you a different question.
Good answer.
So I'm curious. I mean, we talked about what the things we need to think about and be cautious of. From your perspective, coming from outside the area, how do we start to begin to think about managing these things so that we can protect our natural systems and support our resilience? What are some solutions?
Mhm. Well, and I'll probably, to some extent, answer the previous question and get to where you're going. I think one of the real challenges of appreciating and understanding natural systems is knowledge, understanding those systems as a citizen, as people in the community. And when you look at the natural systems that are here, they're like anywhere that's a built environment, they're highly impacted, right? I mean, in some places they're probably closer to natural, but I spent some time in Cape Coral last semester, and that is a natural system that is highly engineered and built. And so the ability for people to understand that is a challenge, right? If you can't understand it, if you can't walk out of your front yard into your yard and understand the impact that your yard has on the environment, then that's a huge disadvantage, right? It's a huge disadvantage to you understanding your own risk in an event. Why did my house flood? Well, because it's in a wetland, but you might not have known that had there been no natural environment left to tell you that. So I do think there's a huge question of educating people around, making them an owner, a part of an understanding of the system itself. And so in terms of building more respect for and a greater concern for the natural systems, to me, it really does start in people's backyards. It starts with the built environment. So, there's hundreds of thousands of people living here. And so when they appreciate a natural system over there, it might be something relatively reserved. It might be something they use on the weekends. They don't worry about it the other 6 days out of the week. So I think that understanding of the built environment as the kind of way that we respect the natural environment, I think is really important.
Such a great point. I think that people move here and they see the natural systems, the natural resources as something that they can go visit that's outside of themselves, not recognizing the impact that every single thing that we build has on those systems and on the system as a whole. And then turning that around, the impact that it has on us when we're faced by a natural disaster, the interconnectedness, right? So really, really good point. And I think one of the challenges we face in Florida is that most people aren't from here, right? So a lot of people don't really understand how this natural ecosystem worked and how it works now. And so it's a really fantastic point. All right, Nicole, what would you like to add?
All right. So I think you all just touched on a few points that kind of encompass what the mission of the National Estuary Partnership is. And it's one, helping to educate both the public and decision makers on what is the natural environment and how we're not separate from the environment. We do tend to think of ourselves as separate from the environment, but we are a part of the environment. And I think this storm taught us more than anything that, human health is environmental health and vice versa. The other thing is our economic health is also dependent on our natural resources. We conducted an economic valuation study for this area to put some hard numbers on it, just again, because you want to put that type of information in the hands of people and help them understand what's really going on in the hands of decision makers. And according to our economic valuation study, and again, using real numbers, economic data, it's 7 billion annually in Lee County. Is produced, it has economic effects just in Lee County from natural resources, which is a really big deal. And educating those that are living here and those that are making the decisions here and providing those tools is a huge part of what we do. We build a number of tools like that to go out and do the scientific modeling and then streamline that data down to sort of an understandable bite, because that's, we're all busy. We all have things we have to do. But at the same time, protecting these natural resources is going to be so impactful. It already is impactful to us, but moving towards the future as well. And when we're looking at restoration and when we're looking at what we're building, adding in additional funding for buffering for some of the, the impacts from a little bit of different freshwater flows, different rainfall patterns. There's going to be differences in the amount of salinity gradients. We're going to see sea level rise. We're going to see some of the salinities impacting our rivers and ecosystems, and that's going to impact us. It's not just these natural areas, but helping to package these tools and put them in the hands of decision makers is a lot of what the work we do is. And I think we saw it too, post-storm, we were doing a lot of surface water quality sampling and seeing what's going on in our surface waters. And that's not something that maybe we were even thinking about. We were thinking about health, home, and, drinking water. But at the end of the day, too, that ended up impacting us when we were looking at what was going on with Vibrio in our waters afterwards. So again, our environment, we are a part of our environment. We are animals in our environment, and making sure that if we protect it, it's going to protect us. And so we have that science back on how those systems do protect us and where we can be, understanding that there's going to be needs for economic growth. And so how do we be strategic about it? How do we be opportunistic? How do we build that into the environment that we already have and improve the systems we already have is going to be really important going forward.
Yeah. So this idea of being strategic, because there's so many different values associated with our natural systems and the potential impacts that it can have when they get destroyed or when we are facing a disaster. All right, Mike, so can you help us understand maybe from an outside perspective, how others might be rethinking the relationship between natural resources and resilience, or what your sort of outside perspective would be on that?
Right. So you've heard from the scientist, right? And now you get to hear from me, but I'd just like to double down what's being said. I mean, we live in our natural environment, and so on blue sky days. And so we need to make sure that we're doing our level best to ensure that, we're doing the things that we need to do. I mean, y'all have all the information down here in South Florida. I mean, I was reading the report card about water quality. We cannot take water quality for granted. I mean, it's a real thing. And a lot of places in the world, they don't have good water quality. And I'm a former director of emergency management for the state of North Carolina. I always told my guys is that then when the wastewater plants are not functioning and the water infrastructure is not working, you're having a very bad day. And so you got to make sure that you're taking care of those things. And you're talking about resilience and critical infrastructure. One of the things that we've been working on in North Carolina is repositioning our resilient infrastructure. So the ones that keep getting hit in a repetitive way, we make sure that we're putting them in a different place if we can. This is a great opportunity now for Florida and Lee County, because what you're going to need, and I probably shouldn't even talk about it right now, but I'm going to do it. So there's a lot of revenue streams coming at you, everything from the Infrastructure Act to CDBG DR, CDBG mitigation, your public assistance program. You gotta sync up those programs and sequence those programs so that you can make sure that you harden your critical infrastructure and get them in a good place. Also, you've heard it down the row here. thoughtful development is huge as we, work on our natural environment, because you'll see the clash between folks that want more development and folks that are looking to preserve mangroves, and all the other natural resources. So you have to work together to move forward, right? It's not one thing or the other. I think you can do them both in a synchronized manner and by working together.
Okay. So given the interconnectedness and the large importance of our natural system, both as an economic driver, but also as protecting us for our future resilience, and the need to think about how we go forward, not just because we have work to do just because of Hurricane Ian, but because of the future development and growth. This place is growing very, very rapidly. What I'm hearing is we need a strategy that we're all kind of getting behind. We need to be strategic in thinking about how we're going to do that so that we can balance both the growth and our dependence on these natural systems, because we depend on them in so many ways, right? So you made it through the first question. Now we have this opportunity here. If you're a branch member, you can scan this QR code. A couple of branch members have already taken advantage of this, but you can submit initiatives that you think that are sparked in your mind from these conversations. If you would like to, you can take a picture of that. You should get a link. You can also, go to the website and do that as well. But the topic is protecting, restoring, and enhancing natural resources, supporting health and resilience. And the key questions are, what are the most powerful actions the region can take to protect the waterways from pollution and promote natural-based solutions to resilience? Okay.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
So I just want to basically compliment y'all on how you have built this recovery task force based on the National Disaster Recovery Framework. It's very mature. It's good governance. And I really haven't seen anything like it, certainly not in my state or anywhere else in the nation. So I think you're to be commended on that, because working together in this unified way and charting your own path forward, that's the way to get things done. Thanks.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm going to keep this up here for you as we go through the rest of the questions, but I wanted to make sure you all had it as things come to mind. You can go ahead. Use your microphone.
Kate Gooderham, Natural Resources. I think there is one thing that needs to be kind of overarching, and that is that natural resources are infrastructure, and that it is cheaper and less stressful and everything else, all the other things that you consider, to keep it in good health than it is to try to fix it later. And our poster child for that is Lake Okeechobee. And in addition, and I think that has to be overarching, and we have to keep remembering it. We have to protect our natural resources because it is cheaper to do it, and it's the right thing to do as well. And those that are looking at things from a fiscal point of view, this is the only thing you can do, is to protect our natural resources. They do so many jobs for us, and these people up front who are specialists and so well trained can list all the jobs they do that we don't have to pay for if we will protect them.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, James.
So I just wanted to add, and that's why we've been at the Natural Resources branch asking for a cost benefit analysis. I think economics have to be at the basis of all of the work the branches do, whether it's infrastructure or natural resources. Natural resources is part of the infrastructure. We need to be able to assess the economic benefits of our natural resources, of our water quality, to the sport fish industry, to our tourism-based economy. And I think without that, it's going to be really hard to justify some of these projects. So I think that's going to be at the basis of what we do, and it needs to be done soon.
Okay. All right. And then Maya, did you have something you wanted to add based on your comment earlier that you had a few more things you wanted to say about that question?
we'll see what the next questions.
Okay.
hold.
The next question is about balancing property rights. And do you feel like that'll get to where you want to go? Yeah. Okay. All right. Don't tell me you want to say more and then not say it, because I'm going to come back to you. Okay. If I remember, that's the key. Did I have enough caffeine? All right. So the next question is, and I'm going to let you all answer these. I'm not going to like go down the row. Okay. So if you have something to say, answer. If you don't, that's okay. So while respecting property rights, are there ways to increase access to natural resources for all community residents? This is a question that came specifically from the Economic Recovery Branch. Curious what your thoughts are on that. How could we increase access to natural resources for all community residents while respecting property rights? Roland?
Step aside from private property. Lee County, through their Conservation 2020 program, has acquired over 30,000 acres of land since its inception. And nowhere is there a restriction from public access. It may be primitive in some cases, but there's also full-fledged parking and other type of activities and other preserves. So I'm not aware of any kind of issue in terms of access or having access to natural resources that the county acquired. Now, sometimes the process takes a while. I mean, because it's a willing seller program. It goes through a nomination process. It goes through a ranking. And once it's ranked, it goes through a committee. And then it also then goes to due diligence. If it's selected, then negotiations with the property owner. And then you're going through the whole acquisition. Then we develop a management plan for the property. And ultimately, you have to do whatever restoration or public access type of activities depending on the site. So there's a lot of resources out there if people feel that they're not. Now, in terms of private property, if you're on riparian waterways, you're kayaking, realistically, nobody can kick you off because they really don't own the waters of the state. So I'm not sure where that issue lies or if there is an issue. So maybe somebody else on the panel can answer that.
James?
I'll just jump in. So I personally don't think there are issues with private property rights and access to our natural areas. We own and manage over 2,000 acres in the region with 1,200 on Sanibel. We provide a lot of access to our private lands, but I think it has more to do with people that are large landowners that are, have properties that are still intact, natural systems that are part of the infrastructure, and how we regulate development and impacts to those natural areas that are currently contributing to benefits to water quality and habitat for wildlife and things like that. So I think the Lee plan actually does a pretty good job of protecting those areas like mangrove forests, things like that, put a level of protection that's appropriate for the sensitivity of that ecosystem. So I think when I look at private property rights, people have the right to develop their land, but that doesn't mean that we have to look for opportunities to give them more intense uses or more density on a property that should be protected in a way that's appropriate for that ecosystem like a mangrove forest. So I think there's a lot of benefits to protecting those natural systems that are outside of, public ownership. They're also in private ownership that are privately owned that could be developed, and just thinking about how that contributes to the greater part of the infrastructure of the entire county. I think that's going to be important as well.
Jeff?
So, yeah, as you said, I'm not from here and not as familiar with the specifics, but I just jotted down private property and public benefit as two things that the
Yes.
question sort of
Yes.
establishes as the goal, which is a challenge. And I think that we need to acknowledge that sometimes our private property desires are in conflict with public benefit, and things that leap out are exclusionary single family zoning forces us to develop in an extremely wide, extremely broadly, which leads to transportation, which leads to a lot of underutilized land, which could be more either intensely built upon, which would allow for more intense natural areas too, right? So that's one thing. The other thing would be questions of bulkheading, right? I mean, that's a private property right that people will defend. that does not provide for public benefit necessarily, right? And oftentimes it is in direct conflict with public benefit. So I think that the way the question is stated as a private, let's take private property as a sort of something that's somewhat sacrosanct here, I think should be discussed in an open way and in a healthy and friendly way to say, what about private property are we talking about? Insurance is a public, insurance prices are driven by things well outside of my private property rights. And so there's a lot to private property, which is not simply controlled within that boundary. So to say, I should get to protect this is mine, and yet I should benefit from the public benefits. These are important questions. I don't have the answer.
Yeah, well, you're on the panel to have the answers for us, don't you know? Okay, so this is a great point, and I think this is really what the economic recovery branch was asking us. Not what are we already doing? The question is increase. And does the situation that we're in right now provide some opportunity to think about or think differently about how we respect property rights, but also increase access to natural resources for all community residents, but also for resilience, right? We may have learned a few things about some of the properties around, Lee County as well in this most recent experience and in all the ones that came before. So anybody want to add anything else to this conversation, Nicole?
I just wanted to kind of speak to, just talking economics and private lands, to continue thinking about ways to incentivize private landowners to have conservation easements on their lands and make that beneficial to them. When we talk about, agricultural lands provide benefits in two ways. They're working lands, but also that provides places for, floodwaters to go or extra water to go, water storage, water quality benefits as well if they have wetlands on their properties, and figuring out ways to help them keep those wetlands on their lands, and because it's costly to maintain those lands, and thinking about how that actually, even though that's private property, it provides a public benefit. I myself live up in Northport, and I think about some lands that were just recently preserved just north of me that I don't, there was a lot of flooding in Northport after this last storm. And if those lands were developed at that point, that flooding probably would have reached me because that gave a place for that rainwater to go. So continuing to keep that in mind, like how do we help those that have those rural and family lands, and how do we support that policy wise, and thinking about that, because again, they do provide a public benefit. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Maya, real quick.
Sorry, I tried to be quick.
Yeah, you're good.
So Cape Cod is very unique in this way that the vast majority of the water interface, the waterways, is actually private land. So in Cape Cod, you have people that have waterfront lots, and then you have people that are on land and don't have access to waterways. They are very limited access point to the canal system. All of them are really private properties. So the city has been working in increasing access to neighborhood, boat ramp type parks. But I wanted to touch base on what has been said here. So if we look at, private landowner access for economic growth, and we want to think about natural resource preservation and how we're gonna, grow economically, but also be mindful of it. I think that we should also think about utilizing areas that are already developed, that already have maybe bulkheads, that already have a lot of pressure on the environment, and think about ways of offering more access in those areas rather than going into developing properties that would require more impact to natural resources, such as mangrove that would be up for development, to put a boat ramp, boat slips that would be moved from an area to another to impact. So maybe think a little bit about areas that are already highly developed, that maybe might not be at capacity. I know the Cape Coral canals are not, at capacity when it comes to boat traffic and things like that. But trying to consolidate those areas rather than expanding in areas that would be actually more suitable for conservation through 2020 or other.
Yeah, so you're touching on what Kate said, which is this idea of better to keep what we already have as natural as we can, and think about how we can maybe rethink some of the properties that have already been developed, because that impact has already happened there, right? Okay. And this idea, Jeff, I think you were getting to sort of like this clustering of development instead of spreading it all out across everything. Daniel?
Yeah, and to get back to the question, I think the access to natural resources is obviously super important. It's important to myself and I think everybody in the community, but there's also the resilience they provide. A lot of our natural resources here in Southwest Florida are kind of like your internal organs. You don't really appreciate them until there's something wrong with them, and then you've got to go in and try to get that fixed. A lot of the resources that I think are most vulnerable are probably not very appealing from to access. I know we've talked a fair amount about 10 Mile Canal and the floodplains that go into that. There's properties in there that were purchased decades ago, probably with some intent to do something other than leave them as a natural resource, that now I think after both Irma and Ian, we've realized that if those were a more intensive use than what they are right now, that would have resulted in a lot more disastrous outcomes for our community. Again, if you were to put a picture of those up on the screen of what those areas look like, probably would not have a whole lot of curb appeal for anybody to go have a picnic there this weekend, but they do have a lot of value to the community. So I think that's something that, to go back to that question, maybe bring that back to whatever branch brought it up and say it's not just about the access, but it's also about the resilience that they provide. Because I think you really have to look at those together. You have to look at all the value that any individual piece of our natural resource provides, and not just sector out and say, oh, this is great access. Well, it's also a great flood protection and other stuff. And 40 years ago, maybe we're just a little naive to how important that was, but now we've learned our lesson, hopefully.
I want to add one other thing. So just because we have some of these systems that are developed and impacted doesn't mean that they can't be restored. I think there's the opportunity to also find some of these areas with more intense uses and try to restore them with somewhat of a natural system to create that resiliency and the buffer and all of the ecosystem benefits that are provided by natural systems.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I think it is, some of the questions that come up may be pointed at one single point, but I think what you all have made really, really clear today is the multi-pronged value of anything we can do to protect our natural resources and systems, whether they're next to train tracks or in an industrial area or the beaches, which is what most people are always thinking when they first think about sort of Florida's natural systems. Anybody want to add anything else to this conversation about access or the ability to think about how we can respect private property rights, but also just protect our natural resources for the health and safety aspect of what they do for our community? Anybody have anything else to add? Okay. All right. So the next question is like 4 questions in one. So I'm going to maybe start, I'm going to read them all to you. You do not have to answer every single one of them, but just to give you an idea of where we're going with them. So what are the best known vulnerability assessments currently scheduled, and when will the results be available? Is there more that we need to know about the risk to our natural infrastructure? And how have other communities set priorities? So if you have a response to any part of those questions, I'm going to let you just raise your hand. But what are the best known vulnerability assessments that are currently scheduled, and when can we expect those results? Is there more that we need to know about the risk to our natural infrastructure? We did already mention that we need an economic study of the value of our natural systems, but is there anything else beyond that that we need to know that's maybe specific to risk? to our natural infrastructure? And how have other communities set priorities in this area? Lind?
Yes, Lee County is getting ready to conduct the vulnerability assessment. We're getting ready to hire the Woods Hole group to do that work for us. It's going to our board June 20th. And that will look at all of our critical infrastructure, do the vulnerability assessment, look at sea level rise, rainfall events, tidal surge, and combined storm events. So that will look at all of our infrastructure. It's tailored, the contract's tailored to the state program, because at the end of the day, when we have this study in hand, we want to be able to apply for resiliency dollars for our projects. The study's not easy. It's a lot of detail, a lot of modeling. So it's going to be done, and we're looking around June 2025 for completion. I think Irma and Ian really kind of showed us how vulnerable our system is. And, so it's, I don't know how much more we need to learn before now and then, other than the modeling and analysis and going through what levels and elevations, all of our critical infrastructure. But we're looking at the transportation, evacuation routes, wastewater plants, electric supply, solid waste facilities, communications, community emergency facilities, schools, healthcare, all the whole 9 yards in this analysis. And it's going to be countywide.
Roland, do you think there's any opportunity to learn from that while we're waiting for the fully complete plan? I mean, I think you're right. We know a lot, right, based on what we've already experienced. And so thinking about solutions is really important now. But do you expect that we'll be able to glean some information as you all are gathering it, as you cross milestones in that couple-year project?
Well, I mean, real simple. If we're rebuilding some of the facilities that we need to do like now, I mean, we do have high water marks. We do have previous modeling analyses. We have the projected sea level rise analyses. So we don't have to wait for that to have, work being done. But it's critical that we do get that opportunity, so we know holistically, so we can start prioritizing the balance of our community's needs.
Yeah, I like the idea that it's not just focused on one aspect or from one perspective, right? It sounds like it's got a nice cover of all the things. All right, others on this idea of like, what do we know in terms of vulnerability assessment? What's coming? What else do we need to know in order to think forward about solutions?
So I'll just give a plug for some of the work that has been done on Sanibel. Mike Savarese over at Florida Gulf Coast University did a vulnerability analysis for the city of Sanibel and Captiva several years back, where he took a community approach where we look at different sectors within the community and how they would be impacted by a storm. And a lot of what was predicted, vulnerabilities, the vulnerability hotspots and things like that, really were true when we assessed the impacts of Hurricane Ian. There's some things that we also learned about, ebb tidal surge and things like that we didn't know. But what we do know is that some of the natural systems on Sanibel did do a great job of holding back the impacts in some areas. In some areas they didn't. The natural systems were degraded, but if they were all developed, then we don't know what would have happened, but we can look around Lee County and probably make a pretty good guess. So I think that's probably a good building block as we look at vulnerability assessments. I know Punta Gorda was one of the first ones to do a sea level rise adaptation plan. But I think that the work that Lee County is doing with Woods Hole is going to be fantastic for the entire county. But I do think there's a lot of projects that we could be doing in the short term. Wastewater treatment plant upgrades from septic to sewer, that's an opportunity, hardening of those plants. And, just trying to build back in a way that takes into account the high water marks and things like that. I think that's really important. Setbacks are another thing that I think as communities rebuild, setbacks from the beach or the bay are going to be really important.
Yeah, I think that, what y'all have already done down here, like with the Conservancy for Southwest Florida, where it rates the estuaries and the water quality, that's great for me as a citizen to go online. That could easily, I think, probably be updated. But you can't ever know too much about how your natural systems are helping you. And so when we installed natural systems along some of our coastline in North Carolina, you always go pre and post disaster to see basically, how they held up and, did they mitigate any extra damages? So I think good deal that you're doing that study. It seems very comprehensive and, but also I agree, we need to take a look at, making sure that we can take low hanging fruit as you go along the way and and to take care of some of the issues that are popping up that you got to take care of anyway. And I'm a big believer in making sure your wastewater plants are hardening. That's what we always told our team back in North Carolina.
Yep. Nicole?
You brought up a really good point that reminded me of a couple of tools that we already have currently available that we hope will be able to be incorporated into some of the vulnerability assessments that are going on. And actually the NEP is also contributing some funding to all of the 10 counties in our particular partnership area, Lee County being one of them, towards their vulnerability assessments for any other data gaps that they'd like to fill to that sort of meet the needs of the NEP, which is natural resource protection. So that's something that we hope will hopefully be beneficial when they complete their vulnerability assessment. But there's a couple of tools that that our partners have built in the last few years, looking at hydrology in a couple of the watersheds that are impactful to Lee County. So there's the South Lee County Watershed Initiative, and there's the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Watershed Initiative, which is just a little bit north of here, but it is still impactful to Lee County. And so these partners all got together and said, okay, well, rather than treating the symptoms, let's look at the causes. What's going on with the altered hydrology in our area, and how is it impactful to natural systems, and how can we come up with solutions that are beneficial to natural systems, but also still meet the needs of flood mitigation in downstream communities. And so those models are completed and publicly available. We worked with all of our partners to build these and review these. So we already have the buy-in from the permitting agencies, both water management districts were involved, DEP, FWC. And so we kind of have we have these models that were built by all of the partners that would be doing the work in this area. Lee County as well was really really impactful on the outcomes of these. And then we built out reports with recommendations based on, projects that our partners were considering putting funding towards. And again, I just reminded me when you said the low hanging fruit, what projects do they have in mind that could be low hanging fruit? How impactful would those projects be? Because again, there's always limited time and resources to do any type of work. So looking at that in that model and seeing, okay, how will this be impactful? How will this be beneficial to natural resources? How will this be impactful to downstream communities? And those are all, there's gray and green infrastructure solutions outlined in those reports, and also looking at different levels of development and how that will affect the natural systems that we have and the ecosystem services that they provide. How will those be impactful to, again, flood mitigation in those downstream communities? But those are a couple of tools that are already online, and some of those projects are actually moving forward, helping those partners do that. But I think those can be, pieces of the puzzle as people continue to build forward and decide what to do next. But those are things we could do now that we know. We don't have to be perfect and say, what's going to be the thing that solves climate impacts in this area, but what do we know now? And a lot of any project that benefits natural systems is going to buffer some of the worst impacts from some of these climate things.
And I like what she just said. It's not everything all at once. It's one step at a time. And watershed initiatives, helping you understand how they affect you and what you're doing, I think it's critical. And I would invite you to look at what Louisiana's doing in their watershed initiative. And it's just like yours. It's multi-jurisdictional. It crosses, county lines and parishes. And so, but everybody's working together regionally to come up with good solutions for flooding.
Yeah, I might be repeating, but I think that the values that people have shouldn't be underestimated, meaning that what the community wants should be a part of what the vulnerability is. And what I mean by that is that we can generate maps, we can gather data, we can show what the risks are all we want. At the end of the day, then you're still left with a map that might or might not be interesting to people. They might or might not want to act on it. And so unless you have projects that the community is behind, you end up with the plan that sits on the shelf. So I think it's really important to engage these design projects, these opportunities, these opportunistic projects. There's things that could happen today to really sort of build consensus around adaptation. And I think it's important too that, and I, as a designer myself, I mean, I just find the word vulnerability assessment to be kind of like, not the happiest sounding word, right? It's sort of it's like, I could find something else to do this afternoon to worry
Right.
about that. But a new park, a new school,
Yeah.
you know, a new amenity is something that everybody can get behind. So to really look at this as an opportunity for the future, not to see it as a sort of mitigation of problems that we have today.
Yeah. So Jeff, this brings me back to your first comments about how important it is for every community member to kind of understand what the value of our natural resources are so that we can protect them, but also getting buy-in in order to be able to move forward with important projects, recognizing that there is no single project that's going to fix all of this. It's going to be a lot of different tools in the toolbox, right? And we have to be thinking broadly because it's not just islands, it's also inland and rivers, and it's, you know, it's a lot of different issues related to water and critical infrastructure that natural resources provide. So this idea of engaging the community in a way so that they're on board with this, I think is a really interesting one. And I think that it's something that is particularly challenging in an area like this where people are coming and going all the time. So I'd be interested if you have examples of places or strategies that communities have used to do that in a way that has been successful. You don't have to say now, but if you do think of them, let us know. And then Kate, I think you had something you wanted to say.
I wanted to add to a study. Captiva Island actually did 3 vulnerability analyses. One was done by consultants for South Seas Resort, one was done for the Captiva Community Panel, and one was done by the Captiva Erosion Prevention District. So they have analyzed themselves nearly to death. But it is a good example of looking very closely at communities. And I think one of the things we're going to have to do once the Lee County vulnerability assessment comes out is to break that down into smaller components, because what we care about is me, you know? And so my little corner of the world, I'm going to care about what the vulnerability assessment says. And that corner of the world don't care so much. And so we are going to have to communicate and educate people based on where they live and what kind of impact it has on them.
Yes.
It's ready to crawl through what's going to do.
There we go. Okay. Bonita Springs actually did something, I think, that addresses what you're talking about. The design for floods in this area, most of them, more than just Lee County, is a 25-year storm. After we had Irma, I had a discussion with our city manager, assistant city manager, attorney, and I said, we've got to do something, because every time we approve a new development, it's always built just a little higher than the next one, the old ones around. I said, it's not right. We have a moral obligation to not let this happen, to where the new one floods the old one that was just built maybe 10 years ago. So what happened was we found up in, I think it was Sarasota County or Sarasota, if you build up there, they give you software that's developed for them, and you have to input everything around the new development, and you run a storm scenario, and you cannot end up with results that show that the existing areas around it have been developed fare worse in a flood than they were without it. So what we did is adopted that, but then we did another thing which was really good. We moved that 25-year storm up to, I called it an Irma scenario, but turns out Irma was a 24-year storm. Most people think it was 100, but if you look in the NOAA data, you'll find out it's 24. We moved it up to 100 years storm. And so by actually increasing the design standards of anybody that's developing, even if you're adding on to an existing development substantially, they have to run that software. They put their inputs in, but then they have to give it back to us when they pass. We give it to an independent consultant that we have, and they analyze the inputs, because anybody with any sense knows you can jigger the inputs to make something pass. So, and it's been working well. We adopted this in 2000, I believe it was 19. So, and it's worked pretty well. Now, we haven't been put to the test yet. The only thing that doesn't handle is the storm surge, but we have more floods than we do storm surges.
Thank you. You can click that off. Yes.
One of the overriding themes that I've heard from every single one of you, no matter what your area of expertise was, education, education, education. And to what Tessa said about we being such a transient community, and what Kate just said about every individual pocket of community has their own concern. What I found during Ian, our community was minimally impacted, but those impacted, the impact was catastrophic. And for those that were living along the bay versus those that lived on the east, they didn't even know what happened in their own community, nor were they concerned, because it didn't affect them. So I think our biggest challenge will be to get the community buy-in into whatever we decide to do. And I think that's going to be very hard, given the mentality of the people that live down here, that live in their own little private, in most cases in my community, homeowners associations and gated communities. And we have to figure out a way to reach everyone. And as a whole mindset, figure out how do we tell them just what we have to do, from preserving the environment to the interconnectivity, to the economic development that will happen, that has to be done strategically. That, I think, is our biggest issue.
I would say too, what you're talking about probably gets the least amount of funding is the education and outreach. So thinking about when we're doing all of these plans, building in an additional budget for outreach and education is huge. And science communication, that's something that we always struggle with in our science. Like, how do we communicate it out, and building the time and budget and staff for doing that, for getting that community buy-in. And I did have one example I was thinking of a project that was, James had mentioned the adaptation plan that City of Punta Gorda did. And one of the projects that was outlined in there was a stormwater project where they actually, and it was for flood mitigation, because City of Punta Gorda gets sunny day flooding, it's very low lying. And so they wanted to protect the mangrove fringe along their shoreline. So they built a little harbor walk along that so the public could come by and see it. They had a big, ribbon cutting event. They had signs. And then we put in partnership with the city and DEP and FWC and Nature Conservancy and a number of others I'm probably not listing here. We put in an oyster restoration project in a place where everybody could see it, where people could see the three, and it was a pilot project to help those agencies that would be doing future restorations potentially understand what was going to be the best type of restoration technique to use in that particular area. But the people you could see from this beautiful like harbor walk mangrove fringe, you could see the three oyster restorations. And I think helping people to sort of be able to just physically see it and almost like put a face to a name, and then they feel protective of it too, because now it's part of their community, would probably be a good example of getting the community buy-in. And of course, we had community groups come and help us do, get the oyster shells, bag them up, install the oyster shells out in the waterway too. So then of course they have that, connection to it, because it's their restoration project. It's not just ours that they're seeing. So, but yeah, the education, outreach, and funding and time for that is going to be huge.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's a great example of a solution. So we have less than 10 minutes left. And so I want to know if our panel has any other sort of solution oriented recommendations that you would make, or examples that you think we should look at as the branches try to, hone their priorities across not just natural systems, but the way natural system affects the other parts of the community?
I'll kick it off. I think a couple items, conservation as a tool to make our county more resilient. I think that's an approach I would certainly support. I think looking at underground utilities throughout our most vulnerable areas so that we can get the power lines underground instead of in the streets after a storm event. That will allow us to have more trees along streetscapes. It promotes wildlife habitat. There are numerous benefits, and I know there's islands like USEPA and others that are great examples that it can work. And I think we should explore that. And last, I think focusing just on nature-based solutions when we're talking about living shorelines and shoreline stabilization, building our dunes larger, more extensive, putting mangroves wherever we can, maybe converting seawalled areas to bulkhead areas to mangroves is another opportunity to not only just, to restore these ecosystem services that were previously provided before they were seawalled, but also making our communities more resilient.
When you said the first part, conservation
As a tool.
As a tool, so are you-
acquiring land specifically to create buffers in our most
Okay,
vulnerable
I didn't know if
areas.
you meant to help with sort of the public understanding of why conservation is important.
No, I think that's part
Okay,
of the
so just-
education
just
component that
doing
we
it-
talked
okay,
about
okay.
pretty extensively.
Perfect. Others? Maya? And then
Yes.
Nolan?
So I think there's timeline. So what is now and what is the future? So for right now, we have a lot of funding coming. We have a lot of hardening and things like that. So what I'd like to see as a solution to both, improve on the use of natural resources as natural base for development and redevelopment is to incorporate natural resources solution within large project and large infrastructure, whether it's the construction of a new bridge, construction, hardening of utilities, wastewater treatment plants. I think natural resources and nature-based solution as a synergetic component of those large projects is essential. And this is something we need to do right now. We need to incorporate it. When it comes to the long term, we need to really look at our regulation, our local codes on how we want to incorporate those nature-based solutions, conservation, not just do the bare regulatory minimum, but the county as a whole has to decide whether we want to take that step and go above and beyond when it comes to incorporating natural resources into building and infrastructure. I think that's about it for now.
Roland, anything to add?
We also have, there's a lot of plans already in place now that recommend projects, flood mitigation projects, and I presented some of those at the branch meeting a month ago. I think we need to move forwards with some of those, get funding for them, pursue that. But one of the things missing, we talk about community engagement, we also need agency engagement, because even though they're nature-based systems, you're going to go through a lot of permitting. And I sit around with Everglades restoration work, and they don't all necessarily look at the environment the same way. There's advocates for this system or that system. Sometimes they conflict with each other. So you're going to need to get these agencies here, South Florida Water Management District, DEP, the Army Corps, the EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service. They all need to look at these things and actually be supportive of these projects as well, or you'll be stuck
That's a
in
great point.
multiple years of permitting.
Great point. Anything else, Mike?
Well, I was going to say, what role does government have in moving all this forward, and not just local government, but state and federal government too, because you can be a lot more successful when everybody's working together for the same objectives. And then I had a question too about beaches. We do beach renourishment up in North Carolina, and it can prove somewhat problematic moving those types of projects forward. And so, but many times they do help mitigate storms for us. And so I was just going to say, how's that working down here? Like with core beaches, natural beaches, community beaches, or y'all getting technical assistance from FEMA and moving those things along pretty well? I'm not going to say quickly, but I'm just curious.
Hold on, let's, I gotta get to I have to wrap up these questions real quick. Or Jeff, did you?
Well, the only thing I would add is that, Florida, and it was said about the gated community. I mean, it is a consumer choice in a lot of cases to live here, and people choose the Florida that they think exists, right? And I think we need to flip the script on that. I mean, the Florida that you see in a lot of cases is not the nature-based solution to Florida's problems. And so natural plantings, green streets, natural drainage systems, I think it really, I'm not saying that it starts and ends here, but it's a really important part for people to understand that where your yard hits the storm drain matters, and what that looks like. It doesn't look like a golf course with green grass running down into the culvert. So I think that natural systems and imagining a Florida, even a single family residential Florida that looks radically different than it does today, I think is really important.
Okay. All right. So Kate, can you answer that really quickly? Like, we have no minutes.
The really quick answer is we have a bunch of beach restoration projects in Lee County. They're funded through local, state, and federal money. It's working quite well.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Okay. So thank you to the panel. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back.
Great, thank you. And so I guess the last thing we would say as it relates to a couple things, as it relates to the branch members, are there any other questions or information that you feel would be important to ask of the panel, that you would like a little bit more information? And then Mike, I think based on your experience, if there's any other sort of focus areas related to natural resources, specifically as it relates to our critical infrastructure, that would be important for this group, for the branches, and for the community as a whole to be thinking about.
So I think that for us, for me and where we live in North Carolina, a lot of attention has been focused on, especially along the coastline, getting rid of septic tanks and, getting connected to a sewer and putting in more infrastructure. And that's really been a focus all the way up and down the coast. Also building, natural shorelines. And I really like what Jeff just said about reimagining what Florida looks like. Jeff came to North Carolina a few years back and worked on a planning charrette for the town of Princeville. And so I think we saw there people working together for the common goal. And really, when it comes down to it, interpersonal relationships and somebody, people really taking the lead, just like you're doing here. I mean, I don't know how excited you guys are, but you need to be, because this is the great opportunity. I mean, don't look at it as, a post-disaster. Look at it as the opportunity to make Lee County better. And so I would just say that and leave you with that, because I think y'all are doing a great job. Thanks.
Anybody else have any questions or anything to add?
Yeah, John, I just have one question. I noticed Friday we have the attainable housing workshop, and I'm just hoping that we have some cross-pollination of the group in here sitting in that workshop, because I was watching a session last week and I heard some comments made about moving along with attainable housing, but some of the thoughts from the group in the room weren't really protecting the environment in their verbiage, and I was quite alarmed. So we need to make sure. Are we going to have some folks from this panel maybe at the 11 o'clock session?
I don't
Friday?
know. Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. The hope
Yeah.
is that we'll have at least participants as part of, whether it's branch members or James is a branch member. I think Maya is a branch member, and so obviously they can attend and participate as a branch member to help facilitate that cross-pollination. And then behind the scenes, we're making sure obviously all of this is cross-pollinated as well.
Thank you.
And that's how the ultimate the plan will be built out is how it will address multiple priorities from multiple branches. Anything else? Great. With that, we will turn it over to public comment. If there is any, I see we have a few folks participating. I'll have to bring you the mic if you want to say anything. So if you would like from the public, raise your hand and I will bring you the microphone. Just state your name. And we do have limited time for public comment. Seeing none. All right. With that, thank you very much for your time. And I hope to see some of you in the next two as well.